In the autumn of 1851, in a second-floor apartment on the Schöne in Frankfurt, a 63-year-old man was eating breakfast alone. He ate breakfast the same way every morning at the same time with the same food. The morning routine was something he had organized with care and defended from variation over the years, because he believed, and he was right about this, as he was right about most things he believed, that creative work depends on the structure around it. A mind that spends energy deciding small things has less energy for the large ones. Coffee, rolls. The Times of London, which he had delivered from England because he trusted the English press more than the German. He had lived in England as a boy, the family spending time in a country his father admired deeply. He read English without difficulty. He found the English capacity for understatement and irony more honest than the German tendency towards systematization, which he had spent his career arguing was a way of making things sound more comprehensible than they were. There was a poodle named Butz. There was always a poodle, always named Butz, or occasionally called by more philosophical names Atman, the world soul, when he was in a particular mood. He felt that the name suited the dog, and that all poodles were, at the level that mattered philosophically, the same animal. The dog sat near the chair and waited, with the patient attention of a creature that has understood the pattern entirely and sees no reason to deviate from it. That morning, a copy of a small literary journal from Leipzig arrived with the post. He set aside the Times. He opened the journal. He found a review of a book he had published 33 years earlier. He had published The World as Will and Representation in 18 at the age of 30, and he had expected the world to stop and pay attention to it. The world had not stopped. The first edition had sat in the publisher's warehouse in Leipzig, largely unsold, for years before being pulped, the unromantic fate of books that arrive before their time. He had published a second volume in 1844. He had published essays. He had continued to work, to think, to walk his route along the main river every morning with the poodle. He had been, for 33 years, almost entirely without readers. The review said that the book was one of the greatest philosophical works ever written in German. He read it once, he read it again, he folded the journal and set it on the table. He fed Butz a piece of roll. He drank the rest of his coffee, which had cooled while he was reading. Then he went for his morning walk. You may not have sat with a version of this morning, but you know, I think, the shape of it, the recognition arriving not when you needed it most, but when you have reorganized your life around its absence. The confirmation that comes after you have, quietly and without much fuss, stopped needing it. He had been carrying the book for 33 years. He had known it was correct. He had known it in the way that people know things they have built from the inside, not with the certainty of someone who has been told they are right, but with the certainty of someone who has done the work carefully and can feel where the joints hold. But the story I want to tell tonight is not the story of the recognition. That is the ending. The story is what came before it. What a man learns about the nature of desire, suffering, and the wanting that will not stop, when he has 33 years of silence in which to watch these things operate on himself and on everyone around him, Let your body settle into the surface beneath you. Let the weight of the day go. We begin. Chapter 2. The House in Danzig. Arthur Schopenhauer was born on the 22nd of February 1788 in the city of Danzig, a prosperous Baltic port that had been, until a year before his birth, a free city under Polish protection, and that would be absorbed into Prussia within 3 years of his birth. He was born into a world in the middle of being remade. Danzig was a city of money and culture in the Enlightenment sense. Merchant wealth, solid practical education, a European outlook that came with trade across the Baltic. The Schopenhauer family had built their position through commerce, the grandfather a successful trader, the father Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer an expansion of that success into a broader European operation. There was a house in the city and a country property outside it. There was comfort and the practical Enlightenment worldview that accompanies comfort, skeptical of superstition, confident in education, respectful of the intelligence that commerce requires. Heinrich Floris was a man of decided opinions and genuine intellectual interests. He admired England with a specificity that went beyond admiration. He subscribed to English periodicals, kept an English library, had travelled to England and believed that English liberty and English commercial culture represented something genuinely better than the German model. He named his son Arthur deliberately, a name that travels unchanged through German, English, and French, the languages of trade. He had plans. His wife, Johanna Trosiana Schopenhauer, was a different intelligence. She was social, perceptive, and possessed of a literary imagination that had not yet found its form. After her husband's death, she would become one of the most widely read German novelists of her generation, known for travel, writing, and fiction that her contemporaries found both entertaining and observant. She was not primarily interested in being a mother, she was interested in being a person in the world among other people who were also in the world. These orientations are not incompatible. They were not easy to combine. In a prosperous merchant household in Danzig in 1788, with a child who arrived as their firstborn and was, from the beginning, exceptional in ways that made ordinary childhood particularly difficult. Arthur was intense. He was sensitive to injustice, not in himself only, but in the world around him. He noticed the structures of things. He noticed, very early, that the family's prosperity and the poverty visible in Danzig streets were related, and that this relationship was not discussed. He kept records of what he observed in notebooks. He was drawn to animals and found the suffering of animals harder to set aside than the adults around him seemed to find it. He grew up in a household that was prosperous and somewhat tense. His parents were not unhappy together in a simple way, but they operated at different frequencies, and Arthur was, temperamentally, his mother's son in some ways and his father's in others, which produced a specific kind of internal contradiction he spent his adult life analyzing. He was already paying very close attention to how suffering worked. Chapter 3. The Merchant's Apprentice. In 1803, when Arthur was 15, his father made him an offer that would shape the rest of his life in ways neither of them could see clearly at the time. The offer was this: a grand tour of Europe France, England, Switzerland, Austria, the great commercial and cultural centers, as a genuine education, not a summer trip, but a serious 2-year engagement with the world. The alternative was to stay in Hamburg and begin at the gymnasium, the preparatory school for university. One path led to the world as it was, seen directly. The other led to the world as books described it. Arthur chose the travel. He was 15. The world was large, and he wanted to see it. He did not fully understand that the offer had a price. The price was this. After the tour, he would enter his father's commercial house as an apprentice. He would become a merchant. He shook hands on this and did not spend enough time understanding what he had agreed to. The tour was extraordinary. He was in London and saw the city of empire and commerce at a scale no German city had yet reached. He was in the north of England and saw the factory districts, the mills, the workers, the coal smoke, and what he saw there was not simply poverty, but a particular structure of suffering that he recognized as meaningful in a way he could not yet articulate. He was in France and witnessed a public execution by guillotine. He traveled through Switzerland and Austria. He came home with a European education and a permanent awareness of suffering at the structural level. He also came home bound by the promise. The next 2 years were spent in a commercial apprenticeship in a Hamburg trading house that he found excruciating. He was bored. He was vastly overqualified for the tasks required of him. He watched time pass in a form that had no relationship to what he actually was. In April of 1805, his father died. Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer fell from the upper window of a Hamburg warehouse. He was 58. The business had been under considerable strain. Whether the fall was deliberate has never been determined. Arthur was 17 years old. His mother made her own choice immediately. Johanna moved to Weimar within months, taking Arthur's younger sister Adele, investing her inheritance, setting up the household in the most culturally significant city in Germany. She organized her life around what she wanted from it. She was good at this. Arthur was left in Hamburg. He honored the commercial apprenticeship for another 2 years. He had made a commitment, and he kept it. Badly and without grace, but he kept it. He read in the evenings. He practiced his languages. He wrote in his notebooks. He was in the wrong life, and he knew it. And the knowing was not bitter exactly, it was precise. He understood exactly what was wrong and why. In 1807, released, he wrote to his mother. He wanted to go to school. She agreed to fund this. He was 19 years old and needed to learn what other students had learned at 12. He was also Arthur Schopenhauer, and he was faster at learning things than most people encounter in a lifetime of teaching. Chapter 4: The Universities and what he found there. He arrived at the University of Göttingen in 1809, 21 years old, and began in medicine, because medicine was what serious people interested in the nature of things studied. He switched to philosophy within a year. He had read Plato. He had read Kant. These were the coordinates of his intellectual world, and they pulled him out of medicine and into the larger question behind medicine, which is not how the body works, but what the world is that the body is in. Plato he encountered through the dialogues. the Phaedo, the Symposium, the Republic, and found something he recognized before he could name it. The theory of forms. The claim that the particular things of the world, this table, this person, this piece of music, are not themselves the fundamental reality. They are instances of something more essential, more permanent, the form of table, the form of person, the form of music. What we perceive through the senses is not the deepest layer. The deepest layer is accessible only through a different kind of attention, not sensory but intellectual, not looking at the shadow but turning toward the light. He kept the insight while rejecting the metaphysics, which is a thing that happens to careful readers of Plato. Kant he found harder and more important. The Kantian revolution. Knowledge is possible because our minds impose certain structures on experience: space, time, causality. These are not properties of the world independent of us. They are the forms our perception takes. We experience the world through these forms and can never step outside them to see the world as it is in itself, the Ding and Sich, the thing in itself. The noumenal world, the world as it actually is, remains forever behind the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us. Schopenhauer heard this and thought, "This stops too soon." Kant says the thing in itself is unknowable. But is it? There is one place where the thing in itself shows through the veil of representation, and that place is the body. When I act, I do not experience myself, only from outside, as an object in space and time. I experience myself from inside. I experience the willing, the striving, the impulse that arises before the action and during it. I experience myself as something that wants. That wanting, that inner pressure from below, is the will. And if the will is the thing in itself in the human body, is it not also the thing in itself in everything? He transferred to Berlin in 1811, where Fichte was lecturing to large, attentive audiences. He attended the lectures and disagreed with nearly everything Fichte said. He was 23. He had no position and no publication, and was already certain that he had seen further than the men with the packed halls. He was, as far as we can determine, correct. There is a piece of music he heard around this time, in Venice, several years later, on a trip to Italy to deliver a completed manuscript, that turned all this theory into something he could feel in his body. We will come back to it. Chapter 5. The Will. He chose an ordinary German word and gave it an extraordinary meaning. Wille, will. In everyday usage, the will is what you exercise when you decide to do something. It is conscious, deliberate, directed. It is associated with agency and intention and the sense of being in charge of yourself. Kant had used the term this way, talking about the rational will, the capacity of a moral agent to choose according to principle. Schopenhauer kept the word and changed almost everything it referred to. His will is not rational, it is not deliberate, it is not conscious, it is the blind, purposeless, insatiable striving that underlies all of existence, human, animal, plant, mineral. It is there before the self that exercises it has formed. It drives the crystal to take its particular shape. It drives the plant toward the light without any experience of light. It drives the heartbeat that keeps you alive without your instruction or attention. It drives the desire that wakes you at 3 in the morning with a specific and wordless urgency. Here is the clearest way into what he means. Think of hunger. You do not choose to be hungry. Hunger arrives. It organizes your attention without your permission. It bends your thinking toward food before you have consciously decided that food is what you need. You can understand hunger completely, its biology, its chemistry, its evolutionary logic, and the understanding will not make you less hungry. The hunger is prior to the understanding. It is the will making itself known through the body. Or think about the wanting that keeps you awake at night. Not a specific desire, not hunger for food or thirst for water, but the general restless, sourceless wanting. The feeling that something is not as it should be. The mind moving through the day's events and finding the ones that went wrong and wanting them to have been different, knowing they cannot have been different, wanting this anyway, unable to stop. This is the will, not a failure of self-discipline, not something to be ashamed of or corrected. The fundamental nature of conscious existence doing what it does. He also says something in these early years that he carries with him always, something about a conversation he had with someone close to him that he never repeated to anyone. He refers to it later in letters, obliquely, the way you refer to something that you have decided to carry rather than to examine. We will come back to it. The central claim is forming. Not just that desire produces suffering, that much you could find in Seneca or in any number of ancient sources, but that desire is structurally incapable of final satisfaction. The will cannot be finally satisfied because satisfaction is not what the will does. The will drives. The driving is its nature. And knowing this clearly, without consolation or explanation, is the beginning of something. Chapter 6. The Mother in Weimar. He visited Johanna in Weimar in 1811 and again in subsequent years, and the visits were, by all accounts that survive, not easy. Johanna Schopenhauer's salon had become, by the second decade of the 19th century, one of the most celebrated cultural gatherings in Germany. She entertained Goethe. She entertained Schiller before Schiller's death in 1805. She had other guests whose names meant something in the Weimar that was then the cultural capital of German thought. Her evenings were known for good conversation and for the particular social art of making a room full of opinionated people feel that they had each been genuinely heard. Arthur came to these evenings and did not participate in this art. He had opinions about everything in German philosophy, and he stated them with a directness and duration that was not suited to the salon format. He was right about most of what he said, this is the complication, but being right in a salon and being right in print are different skills, and he had mastered the latter and not the former. He interrupted. He held the floor too long. He made other guests uncomfortable. When this was pointed out to him, he responded that if the other guests were made uncomfortable by correct arguments, the problem was with the guests. Johanna found this exhausting. She had built something specific that required everyone in it to observe certain conventions, and Arthur treated the conventions as obstacles to the conversation he wanted to have. They were not incompatible human beings exactly. They were incompatible social organisms in that particular room. He did meet Goethe at these evenings, and the meeting was different from the other meetings. Goethe asked real questions and listened to the answers. He shared with Arthur some of his research into color theory, his own challenge to the Newtonian account of light and color, research that the scientific establishment had not received kindly, but that Goethe believed was correct. He gave Arthur access to his materials, his notes, his thinking. They spent an afternoon together in 1813, and Goethe said afterward that the young man had something genuine. Goethe was a good judge of this. Schopenhauer wrote his own contribution to the theory of color in 1816. He kept Goethe's endorsement for the rest of his life. He did not always keep relationships this well. The relationship with his mother deteriorated through these years. There were arguments. There was, in 1831, a final argument on the staircase of her house that he never described fully to anyone. He referred to it later in letters that touch the subject and then move away from it, in the way that you move away from something that still has force. We will come back to it when we reach the chapter where it belongs. They corresponded, but rarely met, after 1831. Johanna died in 1838. He received the news at his apartment on the Schöne Aussicht and did not attend the funeral. He outlived her by 22 years. The books outlived them both. Chapter 7, India and the Veil. He discovered the Upanishads in Frankfurt in 1813, in a Latin translation called Upneck Hat by Friedrich, and what happened when he read them was not what he expected. He had been given the translation in Weimar through the literary network his mother's salon had given him access to despite everything. He expected Eastern philosophy to be mystical in the vague sense, richly metaphorical, light on argument. He found instead precision, a different precision than the European philosophical tradition, but precision nonetheless, the careful investigation of the same questions he had been pursuing through Kant and Plato, arrived at from a completely different starting point over 2,000 years. The Upanishads are the philosophical core of the Vedic tradition, ancient Sanskrit texts concerned with questions that are identical to the questions that had been driving him. What is the nature of reality? What is the relationship between the individual self and the ground of everything? What separates us from the deepest reality, and what is behind the separation? The Sanskrit concept of Maya, usually translated as illusion, but better rendered as appearance or veil, names the layer of ordinary perception that presents the world as a collection of separate objects. The world of distinct things, the world of desires directed at those things, the world we navigate daily. This is appearance. Real in the sense that we inhabit it and must deal with it, but not the deepest layer. The deepest layer is Brahman, the ground of being, the consciousness from which the appearance arises, and the individual self, Atman, is not at the deepest level, separate from it. He read this and recognized his will. Not exactly. The will in his system is blind and purposeless, where Brahman in the Vedantic tradition is often described as consciousness itself, as bliss. But the structure of the insight was the same. There is a veil of appearance, and behind it something that is not individual and not particular and not bound by the objects of ordinary desire. He had arrived at this through the Kantian critique and through his own thinking about the body. The Upanishads had arrived at something related through thousands of years of careful philosophical practice. This was important to him in a specific way. It meant he was not merely constructing a German philosophical system, he was articulating something about the structure of experience that had been accessible from multiple independent directions. The Vedantic tradition and the Kantian critique and his own reflection on what willing felt like from the inside, these had all arrived somewhere similar. That convergence was meaningful. He kept the Upneck hat on his desk for the rest of his life. There is also something he heard in Venice, a piece of music, that confirmed, in the way experience confirms theory, the most important practical claim he was developing. We will come back to it in the chapter where it belongs. Chapter 8: The World as Will and Representation. He wrote the book in Dresden between 1814 and 1818 in rented rooms near the Elbe that were cold in winter and adequate throughout. He walked by the river in the mornings before sitting down to write. He went to the Dresden Opera House when the season had something he thought worth hearing. He worked 4 hours a day at the hardest thinking, and the rest of the day was preparation and recovery. He was 26 when he began. He was 30 when he finished. The book would take 1,000 pages in most translations. He calls it, in the preface, a single thought communicated from 4 different angles. This is accurate and important. The 4 books are not independent arguments, but 4 approaches to the same territory, the way 4 maps of the same landscape at different scales and orientations are still maps of the same place. The first book establishes that all experience is representation, the world as it appears to us, organized through the forms of space, time, and causality that Kant identified. We never see the world as it is, we see the world as our perceptual machinery presents it to us. The second book makes the central claim: behind the world as representation, as its inner nature, is the will, the blind, insatiable, purposeless drive that organizes everything in existence. He demonstrates this first through the body, through the experience of willing from the inside, and then extends it outward. The will is not just human desire, it is the force that drives all of nature, the gravity that pulls things toward each other, the growth of the plant, the migration of birds, the crystal that forms according to no instruction except the will inherent in its nature. The third book is on aesthetics, and it is in some ways the most original contribution. The argument that great art, especially music, provides a temporary release from the will by enabling a mode of perception that is not organized around desire. The aesthetic state is will-less perception, seeing things as they actually are, without the overlay of what you want them to be or how they could be used. The fourth book is on ethics, the argument that compassion, not as a cultivated virtue, but as a direct perception of shared suffering, is the foundation of all genuine morality. And the further argument that the highest human possibility is the ascetic life, the voluntary withdrawal from the will's demands. He wrote one sentence in the preface that nobody quoted for 33 years. He wrote that the reader who truly understood the single thought of the book would find, by the end, that every page was the same thought from a different angle, and that the thought was not divisible without loss, and that the book therefore had to be read twice. He wrote this with complete seriousness and no expectation of being thanked for the instruction. He sent the manuscript to Brockhaus in Leipzig and went to Italy, to Venice, to deliver his contract documents and to be somewhere other than Germany for a while. Chapter 9. Venice and the Opera. He went to Italy in 1818 with the manuscript done and the contract signed, and no particular reason to hurry back to a Germany that had not yet responded to his work. He went to Rome first, then Naples, then Venice. He did what cultivated Europeans had been doing in Italy for generations. He looked at painting and sculpture and architecture with the attention they required. He ate food that was better than the food in Dresden. He walked cities that were organized around different assumptions than the cities he had grown up in. He breathed different air. In Venice, he went to the opera. The opera house was staging Rossini. Gioacchino Rossini was in the middle of his most productive decade. He would write his greatest works between 1815 and 1823, and the production Schopenhauer saw was from this period. Rossini's genius was melodic in a way that operated below rational response. His melodies did not narrate or illustrate. They found something in the listener that was prior to understanding and reached it directly. He had been writing for 4 years about why this was. His theory of music, in the third book of the work just completed, was this: music is different from all the other arts because it does not represent the will. It is the will, given form and made audible. The structure of melody, with its drive toward the tonic and its momentary resting there and its renewed drive, is isomorphic to the structure of desire itself. To hear a great melody is to hear the will's own movement, stripped of any particular content, made pure form. This is why music moves people who know nothing about music, across cultures and centuries. It speaks directly to what all conscious beings share, before education and culture and individual history have had a chance to overlay it. He had written this and believed it. In the opera house in Venice in 1818, the belief became an experience. The soprano sang an aria in the second act. The reviews of this particular production survive and confirm its quality, and something happened to him that he would spend the next 4 decades describing as the central aesthetic. Experience. The willing stopped. He was not, for the duration of the aria, a person with a history and an unread manuscript and a complicated relationship with his mother and a career that had not yet begun. He was a place where the music was happening. The separation between listener and heard had dissolved. The will had briefly ceased, not because it had been satisfied, but because the music had given it something larger than satisfaction, had given it, temporarily, form. He walked back along the canals afterward in a state that he later described as the purest form of the aesthetic release he had theorized. Not happy, exactly, not peaceful in the ordinary sense, present, entirely in the moment he was in, with nothing requiring his attention except the water and the night. If your mind has wandered during these early chapters, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. The night is generous with wandering minds. Chapter 10. Berlin and the empty lecture hall. He returned from Italy in 1819 and applied to lecture at the University of Berlin. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was at the peak of his influence. He had been appointed to the chair of philosophy at Berlin in 1818, the same year Schopenhauer published his book, and his lectures were the most attended in the university. The lecture halls were full twice weekly. Students from across Germany came to Berlin to hear Hegel, and the students who graduated from Berlin's philosophy department went on to shape German intellectual life for the next generation. The Hegelian influence was, in 1820, something close to a monoculture. Schopenhauer believed Hegel was not merely wrong but actively harmful. He believed that Hegel's prose was deliberately obscure, that the technical vocabulary had been developed not to precision but to prevent examination of premises that would not survive scrutiny. He believed the Hegelian system had been organized backward from a desired conclusion, that history unfolds toward a rational order, that the Prussian state represents a moment in spirit's self-realization, and that the conclusion was convenient for Hegel's position within the Prussian academic establishment. He said all of this in print, with specific quotations from Hegel's work that he held up as evidence of fraudulence. Then he applied to lecture at the University of Berlin and scheduled his lectures for the same hour as Hegel's. No students came. Hegel's lectures, one building over, at the same hour were packed. Schopenhauer sat in a room with, on a good day, 8 to 12 students, on a bad day with empty chairs. He gave his lecture to the room. He did this for 2 semesters and then stopped. He left Berlin. He never held a university position again. He spent the next several years in a state that his letters describe as bitter, and that his continued productivity suggests was more complicated than bitterness. He published on the philosophy of vision, on the philosophy of color, on additional aspects of the theory he had worked out in the main text. He traveled briefly to Italy again. He settled in Frankfurt in 1831, in rooms on the Schöne Aussicht that overlooked the Main, and established the routine that would be, with minor variations, the routine of his life for the next 29 years. He was 33. He had written what he believed was the most important philosophical work of his generation. Nobody had read it. He would wait. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius from his farm outside Rome in the 1st century AD, said that the wisest use of time was not the accumulation of possessions or the pursuit of recognition, but the careful attention to what one actually thought and believed. He was recommending a withdrawal from the Roman system of advancement, the forums and the courts and the patronage networks that he himself had navigated for decades. He was 60 years old when he wrote this. He had learned it late, but he had learned it. Schopenhauer, in Frankfurt in 1831, was learning it at 33. Chapter 11. Why desire is suffering. The central claim, stated plainly, desire is structurally incapable of final satisfaction. Not this or that desire, not the desire for something specific that, once obtained, will leave you peaceful. The structure of wanting itself, the will that produces every desire, cannot be finally satisfied because satisfaction is not its nature. Satisfaction is a moment, a transition between one desire and the next. The will produces the desire drives towards satisfaction, the satisfaction arrives briefly, and then the will produces a new desire and the cycle continues. There is no point at which the will says, "Enough, I have what I wanted, now I am done." You may have noticed this. You may have gotten something you wanted, a position, a relationship, a degree of recognition, and felt, in the moment of getting it, a settling that you had expected to be more permanent. And then, days or weeks later, the wanting was there again, pointed at something new. This is not a failure of gratitude. This is the will doing what the will does. He calls the result Leiden, suffering, and he uses the word to cover a wider range than the dramatic suffering of acute pain or loss. He means the fundamental unsatisfactoriness of conditioned existence, the background static of a conscious being that is always oriented toward what is not yet the case, the mild dissatisfaction of ordinary days, the restlessness that arrives in the body when nothing particular is wrong, the mind that runs at 11 at night through the day's events and finds the ones that could have been better and wants them to have been better, knowing they cannot now be different. This is the will. He is not blaming you, he is describing the structure. Plato had said something adjacent in the symposium. You cannot desire what you already have. Every desire is evidence of a lack. But Plato located the solution in philosophical knowledge, in the ascent from particular beauties to the form of beauty, from particular goods to the good itself, where the lack could in principle be filled. Schopenhauer says, no, there is no filling. The will is the lack, not a lack pointing at something that would complete it, a constitutive lack without a complement. The will lacks because lacking is what it does. The philosophical point has a practical implication that he takes seriously. If desire cannot be finally satisfied, then the person who goes through life expecting final satisfaction is going to be continuously and specifically disappointed. And the person who understands the structure will not be surprised when satisfaction fades. Not disappointed less, the will does not produce less desire in a person who understands it philosophically, but surprised less. And in the surprise reduction, there is a small freedom that is real and available. He also points at a specific corollary. If the will cannot be finally satisfied, but can be temporarily quieted, then those moments of temporary quiet are more important than the theory of final satisfaction suggests. The aesthete's hour in the concert hall, the moment of genuine compassion that dissolves the usual boundary between self and other. The sleep that withdraws consciousness from the will every night. These are not consolation prizes. They are the actual thing. Chapter 12. The Aesthetic Release. The first path out of the will's insistence is through the experience of great art. He is careful about what he means. Not all contact with art produces what he is describing. Not all music or painting or literature provides the release. What he is pointing at is a specific quality of attention, the state of genuine aesthetic absorption, which is different from enjoying something or finding it pleasant or even being moved by it in the ordinary emotional sense. The state he calls will-less perception. When you are in genuine aesthetic absorption, when you are inside a great piece of music or fully in a passage of literature that has taken hold, something changes in the quality of your attention. You are not evaluating, you are not comparing, you are not thinking about yourself or your problems or the day's events. You have stopped being a subject with needs. You have become, temporarily, something closer to pure perceiving, the perceiving itself, happening through your body and your senses and your years of accumulated attention, without the overlay of what you want or what you fear. The object of your perception in this state is no longer a means to anything. The painting is not interesting because of what it might tell you or because owning it would say something about you. The music is not good because it matches your mood or because you have been told it is great. It is simply itself, fully and directly, and you are simply in it. The Platonic ideas, the essential natures of things, the forms that particular instances embody, are directly accessible in this state, not through argument, but through seeing. He says that in these moments the perceiving subject becomes a pure subject of knowledge. Not Arthur Schopenhauer with a history and a career and a mother he has quarrelled with and a book that nobody has read. Just the perceiving, happening, just the knowing, without a particular knower behind it. You may recognize this from your own experience. The hours at a concert that passed without wait, the paragraph you read 3 times, not because you didn't understand it, but because you couldn't move past it, because something in it had found the place that was prior to your personal preoccupations and spoken directly to it. The piece of music that stopped the particular mental chatter that had been going all day and replaced it with something that was not silence, but that was somehow quieter than silence. These moments are not trivial pleasures. They are demonstrations, repeated, available, not requiring any particular achievement or belief or practice, that the will can cease, that the insistence can pause, that there is something available in the aesthetic experience that is genuinely outside the ordinary cycle of desire and frustration and new desire. Seneca said that the man who has time has everything, and the man who has no time has nothing. He meant time in the sense of genuine presence, the capacity to be fully in the hour one is actually in, rather than planning the next hour or recovering from the previous one. The aesthetic experience gives that presence, reliably and without requiring anything from you except the willingness to be in it. Chapter 13. Music above all. He ranks the arts. This is characteristic of him. He is not interested in the diplomatic claim that all forms of art are equally valuable in their own ways. He thinks about art the way he thinks about philosophy. There are better and worse arguments, and the differences matter. Architecture represents for him the conflict between gravity and rigidity, the will expressed in the material world's most elemental opposition. Sculpture and painting represent the Platonic ideas, the essential forms of things, especially the human body and human character. Literature represents human character and action in their full complexity. These arts all represent something. They point at the ideas through particular instances. Music is different. Music does not represent the will. Music is the will, given form. He means this as a precise philosophical claim. The structure of melody, the creation of tension, and the movement toward resolution, the drive toward the tonic, and the momentary rest, and the renewed drive is not an analogy for the structure of desire. It is the same structure, directly presented in a different medium. When you hear a great melody, you are hearing the will's own movement, made audible and organized into form. Not this desire or that desire, not the desire for food or money or recognition or love. The structure of desiring itself made pure. This is why music can move people who have no musical education and no cultural familiarity with the tradition a particular piece comes from. It is not communicating a cultural content that requires decoding. It is speaking directly from the will in the composer to the will in the listener, in the will's own language. The movement of the melody is the movement of the will, and the will in every conscious being recognizes it immediately. It is also why music is the most complete form of aesthetic release. Painting provides the aesthetic state by presenting a Platonic idea clearly enough that the viewer can perceive it directly. Music does not present an idea, it bypasses ideas entirely and speaks from the thing in itself to the thing in itself. The release in genuine musical absorption is therefore more complete. Not the cessation of desire as you perceive something beyond desire, but the temporary transformation of desire itself into a form that can be heard without suffering. He plays the flute every evening in Frankfurt for the rest of his life. Not well, the accounts of those who visited him are tactful on this point, but with complete seriousness and with the dedicated attention of a man who has understood philosophically why the practice matters. The evening flute is not entertainment. It is the daily appointment with the thing that reliably provides what philosophy can only describe. If your body is heavy and you are beginning to drift, let that happen. The voice is still here. The music, in its way, is still here too. Chapter 14. The Ethics of Compassion. If the will is the inner nature of everything, if the same blind drive that organizes your desires also organizes mine and the animals, and in some attenuated form the plants, then the apparent separation between individual beings is not, at the deepest level, fundamental. This is the foundation of his ethics. Most ethical systems of his time, Kant's above all, begin from reason. They begin with the rational agent and the rational law, and derive ethics from the application of reason to the problem of how rational agents should treat each other. He finds this cold and, more importantly, wrong about where ethics actually comes from. Ethics, he argues, does not begin in reason. It begins in perception, the direct perception of another being's suffering as continuous with your own. Not sympathy, which is a feeling you manage from a safe distance. Not empathy, which he would have considered too cognitive a term. Something more immediate, the recognition, when you see another person genuinely suffering, that what you are looking at is made of the same thing as what you feel when you suffer. The suffering is not happening to a different kind of thing than you. The suffering is the will, in another pattern, doing what the will does. When this recognition is genuine, when you are not managing it from behind the glass of intellectual distance, but actually perceiving it, something in you responds that is prior to deliberation. This is what he calls Mitleid, meaning literally suffering with. He thinks this is the only genuine source of ethical action. Everything else is calculation, or performance, or habit. But the person who has actually seen through the veil of Maya, even briefly, and perceived the shared suffering underneath, responds to that suffering with something that needs no argument to motivate it. He was, for his time and his class, unusually serious about the suffering of animals. He believed the will to live in the poodle was not fundamentally different from the will to live in himself. Both were expressions of the same underlying drive, the same blind insistence on continuing. An ethics that stopped at the human species was, in his view, incomplete, not because of any argument about rights, but because it had failed to perceive correctly. If you have seen what the will is, you have seen that it operates without regard for species. He gave money to animal welfare organizations. He was precise and consistent about this. He was not performing a position. Simone Weil, the French philosopher who spent a year on the Renault factory floor in 1934 to understand industrial labor from the inside, would write in her notebooks, without having read Schopenhauer, though she had read much else, that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. She meant a specific kind of attention, the willingness to fully receive another person's reality, without filtering it through your own needs or anxieties or comparisons. The not looking away. The seeing what is actually there, including the suffering that is actually there. Both of them thought this kind of attention was the hardest thing. Both of them thought it was the thing most worth practicing. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands open. Chapter 15. The ascetic ideal. The third path is the most radical and the one he lived least consistently. The ascetic is the person who has arrived, through genuine understanding of the will's nature, at the conclusion that the will cannot be satisfied by giving it what it wants, that the cycle of desire and satisfaction and new desire is a cycle that the will itself produces and cannot itself escape, and who has therefore decided to stop feeding the cycle, to reduce the will's demands systematically, celibacy, to stop feeding the reproductive drive, fasting to reduce the demands of the body, poverty, deliberately chosen to stop feeding the acquisitive drive, solitude to reduce the stimulation of desire that other people inevitably provide. He sees this most fully realized in Hindu asceticism, the sannyasi who has renounced everything, and in Christian monastic practice at its most serious, and in Buddhist monasticism. He thinks the saint in the Western tradition and the ascetic in the Eastern tradition have understood the same thing. They have understood that the only way to finally step outside the will is to stop providing the will with the conditions under which it insists. He thinks this is the highest human possibility. He also thinks this is not how he is living, and he says so without shame. He eats well. He has a comfortable apartment with a river view. He has, over the years, relationships with women that are not casual. He keeps fine rooms and a good library and a restaurant table he has occupied for decades. He plays the flute for his own pleasure. He is, by most observable criteria, a man who has arranged his life to be agreeable and has succeeded. He acknowledges this in letters. He acknowledges it in a footnote in one of his essays. He does not find it disqualifying. He is writing philosophy, not hagiography. He is identifying the highest possibility clearly. He thinks that identifying it clearly matters, even for people who will not achieve it, and he is honest about the gap between the identified possibility and his own practice. Rilke wrote to a young poet in 1903 that the right relationship to the hardest questions was to live them with patience, to live your way into the answer rather than forcing an answer before the question had been fully understood. Schopenhauer spent his career living the question of the will. He did not arrive at the ascetic's answer. He arrived at something more modest and, for most people, more useful. The daily cultivation of the things that temporarily quiet the will, practiced with the seriousness that the insight deserves. The morning walk, the flute, the poodle, the 4 hours of honest work, the meal at the restaurant, eaten with attention. These are not liberation. They are something more available. Chapter 16, Venice, 1818. He was 30 years old. The book was finished. He was in Venice. He had come to Venice partly to see Venice, and partly because he had been in Dresden for 4 years, writing the most important work of his career, and he was done, and he needed to be somewhere that was not Dresden, and not Frankfurt, and not any of the places that had been the context of the long effort. Venice in 1818 was a city of extraordinary sensory density. Water, stone, the specific quality of light off the lagoon, the sound of voices carrying across water, the smell of salt and stone, and the history that has accumulated in both. He found rooms near the Rialto. He walked. He looked at painting. He ate. In the evening, he went to the opera. The house was staging Rossini, Elisabetta Regina d'Inghilterra. one of the works from Rossini's extraordinarily productive decade. He had heard Rossini before, in Dresden, but hearing Rossini in Venice in this specific house and this specific season was different. The house had an acoustic that rewarded the music in a way that Dresden's house did not. The cast that evening was exceptional. The soprano in the lead role had a voice that critics of the period described as having an unusual quality, technically accomplished, but also carrying something that went past technical accomplishment. Something that created in the listener the feeling that the sound was coming not from a person on a stage, but from a place in the music itself. He sat in the dark. The aria in the second act, the one he would mention in letters and notebooks for the next 40 years, had a structure that was, in the technical sense, straightforward. It was the melodic shape Rossini preferred, the drive toward the tonic, the brief resolution, the immediate renewal of tension, the drive again. Simple enough to hum, complex enough to be inexhaustible. It was the shape of longing, made audible. The will given form. What happened to him when the soprano sang, it was what he had been writing about in the third book of the work he had just finished. The willing stopped. He was not, for the duration of the aria, a person with a history or a career or a complicated family situation or an unread manuscript. He was a place where the music was happening. The will had not been satisfied. It had temporarily ceased. The distinction matters enormously. Satisfaction would have ended when the aria ended. What happened was different. It was the will's own insistence taking a form that required nothing, wanted nothing, simply was. He walked back along the canal afterward. The water was black and moving. He thought, so that is what I have been writing about. If your mind has gone somewhere else, come back gently. We are still here. You do not need to have caught every word. Chapter 17, Frankfurt and the Poodles. He settled into Frankfurt in 1831 and did not move again. The apartment on the Schönaussicht had a view over the Main that he found genuinely good, not beautiful in the postcard sense, but interesting to watch across the years. The light on the water changing with the seasons and the weather and the time of morning in ways that did not exhaust themselves. He had the same view for 29 years and did not stop finding it worth looking at. He organized his days with the precision of a man who understands that structure is not the enemy of freedom, but its precondition. He woke at 7. He washed his face with cold water. He dressed carefully. He was, by all accounts, a neat and particular dresser. Not fashionable, but specific. The clothes chosen for quality and maintained. He ate breakfast. He read for an hour. He wrote from 8 to noon, 4 hours that he defended from interruption with a ferocity that his visitors found somewhat daunting. He believed that 4 hours of fully present intellectual work was the upper limit of what a person could sustain at quality, and that work done past that limit was not worth doing. He stopped at noon without exception. After lunch, he walked. The route was the same route every day, along the Schönaussicht to the corner, down to the river, south along the river to the tree that marked his turning point, back by a slightly different path. that passed a market he had always liked for reasons he could not articulate. The walk was an hour. He did not skip it in bad weather. He owned boots for bad weather and used them. There was always a poodle. The poodle's official name was Butz, though when Schopenhauer was in a philosophical mood, he called it Atman, or, on one recorded occasion, the world soul, at which the dog showed no signs of philosophical recognition. He took the poodle on the afternoon walk. The dog knew the route. In the evenings, he played the flute. The accounts of those who heard him suggest that his playing was effortful and sincere and not particularly accomplished, but that this did not seem to embarrass him. He played for himself and for the philosophical reason, because music provided the aesthetic release he had theorized, and he intended to avail himself of it. It was not vanity about skill. It was practice in the precise sense, the daily return to a state that he knew to be valuable and that he had decided to maintain as part of his life. He thought carefully about the poodle. He wrote about it. He believed that the will to live in the dog was not essentially different from the will to live in himself. Both were the same underlying drive, expressed through different patterns. The dog wanted food, warmth, the company of the particular person it had attached to. It expressed these wants directly, without shame or strategy or elaborate justification. It did not narrate its desires to itself. It did not compare what it wanted to what a better organized poodle might want. It simply wanted and showed the wanting and was content with what came. He admired this. He thought most humans could not manage it. Chapter 18. The Long Silence. Between 1820 and 1851, the main work remained largely unread. He was not idle. He published On the Will in Nature in 1836, arguing that empirical science across biology, chemistry, magnetism, and several other fields was converging on the same conclusion his philosophy had reached through pure reflection, that the will was the inner nature of things. He published The Two Fundamental Problems of Ethics in 1841, comprising the prize-winning essay on the freedom of the will and an essay on the foundations of morality. He published a second volume of the main work in 1844 with supplementary essays expanding every part of the original. He was working. Almost nobody read it. He was bitter about this. His letters from the period do not disguise it. He wrote about the philosophers who cited each other and ignored him. He wrote about the academic establishment that had chosen Hegel and then chosen the Hegelians and had never found room for the work he had done in Dresden in those 4 years, and that he knew was correct. He was sharp about it. He was sometimes unfair. He was also in some way that the bitterness and the continued productivity together suggest continuing to live. The morning walks along the Main continued. The restaurant table continued. The poodle continued. The flute in the evenings continued. He was, in the Frankfurt years of the silence, demonstrating in practice what he argued in theory. That the vita contemplativa, the life organized around thinking and perceiving rather than acquiring and advancing, was a genuinely good life, independent of what the professional world thought of it. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations in a military tent on the Danube frontier sometime around 170 AD. He wrote them entirely for himself. They were a private journal, not intended for publication, not seen by anyone in his lifetime. He was reminding himself of what he believed, because without the reminder, the belief faded under the pressure of daily life as a Roman emperor conducting a war he had not wanted. He wrote in these private notes that his own character was something he could work on regardless of what the world was doing, that the work was available to him in any circumstance. Schopenhauer did not need to write this down. He had built a philosophical system on the same insight and was testing it daily through the silence. The system held. He was not at peace with the silence in any simple sense, but he was working. The work was real. The morning was always available. Chapter 19. What the pessimist actually believes. The label has followed him for 2 centuries, and it has mostly been used to avoid engaging him. If Schopenhauer is the pessimist, then his position can be dismissed as a temperamental disposition, the philosophy of a man who simply saw the dark side of things, and the specific arguments can be set aside without examination. He is not a pessimist in the temperamental sense. He was, by all accounts that survive, a man of genuine daily pleasure. He enjoyed his food. He enjoyed the Frankfurt opera. He enjoyed the morning walk. He enjoyed good conversation, though he found good conversation rarer than he would have liked. He enjoyed the company of his poodle with a warmth that surprised people who expected the philosopher of suffering to be a cold man. He was funny. He was, in the later years, when he was finally being visited and corresponded with genuinely good company. What he was, precisely, was realistic about one thing: the will cannot be finally satisfied. That desire is structurally oriented toward what is not yet the case, and that the moment of satisfaction is always a moment of transition to the next desire, and that the person who has organized their life around the expectation of final satisfaction is going to be continuously and specifically disappointed. This is not pessimism. This is accuracy about one feature of existence that most people find it uncomfortable to acknowledge. Tolstoy read Schopenhauer in the 1860s and described him as the clearest thinker of the century. What Tolstoy found was not despair, but something he experienced as clarifying. The gap between what people want and what getting it provides, the gap that Tolstoy had been living and writing about through his novels without being able to name it as directly as Schopenhauer named it, was suddenly visible, as a structure rather than as a personal failing. Not your fault that getting what you wanted didn't provide the peace you expected. That is how wanting works. Tolstoy said this was one of the most useful things he had ever read. He was not converted to pessimism by it. He was freed from a particular confusion by it. The distinction matters. The person who understands that satisfaction fades is not doomed to unhappiness. They are freed from the additional suffering of being surprised when satisfaction fades. they are also freed from the secondary illusion that the next satisfaction will be the one that finally sticks. And in this freedom, something becomes available that the optimist, the person still waiting for the final satisfaction, cannot quite access. The appreciation of the satisfaction that is actually here, now, without asking it to be permanent. The morning walk in Frankfurt does not need to be permanently satisfying. It just needs to be what it is: a good walk on a good morning with a good dog available today. He had this. He appreciated it. He was not a pessimist. He was a man who had stopped asking for more than what was actually available. Chapter 20. Hegel and the rivalry. The argument with Hegel is not a footnote in his career. It is, for him, a philosophical necessity, a response to what he genuinely believes is one of the most consequential misdiagnoses in the history of German thought. Hegel's position, put as clearly as it can be put outside the technical vocabulary, reality is the unfolding of absolute spirit toward self-knowledge. The world of objects and events that we experience is spirit becoming aware of itself. History is the story of this unfolding, not random or cyclical, but directional, moving toward a rational order in which spirit is fully realized. The Prussian state of Hegel's own time was, in his framework, a late and significant moment in this unfolding. Schopenhauer's counter: the inner nature of the world is will, not spirit. Will is blind and purposeless. It does not unfold toward anything. It does not become more rational over time. History is what the will produces when you give it millennia and competing groups of humans who each want things the others also want. The suffering in history is not a step in a process with a rational direction. It is what happens when insatiable drives collide. He thought that Hegel had made the world sound more purposeful and more rational and more comfortable than it actually was. He thought this was not just an error, but a dangerous error, that a philosophy of history that told people their suffering was a moment in a rational process heading somewhere good made it easier to accept suffering that should not be accepted, and harder to see the will's insistence for what it was. He published his sustained critique of Hegel in the preface to the 1844 second volume of the main work. The language in that preface is among the most direct and least diplomatic he ever wrote. He calls Hegel a sophist. He says the influence is a product of the relationship to the Prussian state rather than the quality of the philosophy. He uses the word charlatan at least once. He was not fair in all of this. Hegel's philosophy has more genuine substance than Schopenhauer's attacks acknowledge. But his central objection, that the idealist tradition had substituted a comforting narrative about the direction of history for an honest look at what the will actually produces, has a force that has not diminished. He was also, in 1844, a man who had spent 25 years watching the Hegelian school receive the institutional attention and professional positions that he believed his own work deserved. The argument was genuine. The bitterness underneath it was also genuine. Both things were true, and the bitterness does not invalidate the argument. Chapter 21. The poodle named Butz. Let us stay with the poodle for a chapter, because the poodle, in Schopenhauer's philosophy of daily life, is not incidental, it is central. He wakes in the morning and the poodle is there. He eats breakfast and the poodle waits near the chair, patient and direct about its waiting, showing the wanting without commentary. He walks in the afternoon and the poodle walks beside him, at his pace, without agenda beyond the walk itself. He plays the flute in the evenings, and the poodle is in the room, not listening exactly, not listening exactly, simply present in the room in the way that animals are present when they are not performing their presence for an audience. He writes about this. He takes the relationship seriously as a philosophical relationship. He believes that the will to live in the poodle is not essentially different from the will to live in himself. Both are expressions of the same underlying drive, the same blind insistence on continuing in existence that drives the plant toward the light and the crystal into its particular form and the heartbeat that keeps going without. Instruction. The apparent boundary between them is real at the level of representation. At the level of the will in itself, the boundary is less absolute. But the poodle has something he values and does not have. The poodle cannot narrate. Language gives human beings the capacity to construct a story about their suffering. When something goes wrong, the human being not only suffers the original suffering, but narrates it, places it in a context, compares it to how things might have been, projects it into the future, assigns it meaning. The suffering is real. The narrative is additional, and the additional narrative is often additional suffering. The poodle is spared this. The poodle's hunger is hunger. When it ends, it ends. The poodle does not lie awake afterward replaying the hour when the bowl was empty and comparing it to a hypothetical hour when it might have been full. The poodle does not construct a story about what the empty bowl means about the quality of its life. He also valued what he called the poodle's honesty about its wants. The dog wanted what it wanted: food, warmth, the company of its person, and showed the wanting directly, without strategy or performance, or the elaborate social mediation that humans wrap around their desires. It was honest about being the kind of thing it was. He found this admirable. He found it, in a specific way, philosophically correct. He named the poodle Atman occasionally when the mood suited him, the Sanskrit word for the individual self that is, at the deepest level, identical with Brahman, the ground of everything. He was making a philosophical joke. He also meant it. The poodle, in his morning rooms, in the lamplight of the evenings, was doing what all his philosophy aimed at, being exactly where it was, wanting nothing beyond what the moment contained, not asking the moment to be different. He was still working on this. The poodle had it figured out. Come back gently if your mind has wandered. We are still here. The night has its own pace, and it is not in a hurry. Chapter 22. The Unconscious Will. In 1925, Sigmund Freud, by then in his late 60s, the founder of psychoanalysis, the most influential figure in the history of psychology, was asked about the relationship between his work and Schopenhauer's. He did not deflect the question. He said that Schopenhauer had anticipated the psychoanalytic unconscious, that the will and the id were the same structure in different vocabularies, and that the pleasure principle, the claim that unconscious drives are organized around the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, was the will's insistence translated into the language of clinical practice. He said the convergence was not coincidence. They had been looking at the same thing from different directions. The id, in Freudian theory, is the reservoir of unconscious drives, the insatiable desires that operate below the level of rational thought, that have been present since infancy, that are not organized around social or moral considerations, that push upward into consciousness in distorted forms because their direct expression would be socially catastrophic. The id wants. It does not negotiate. It does not defer. It simply insists. This is Schopenhauer's will, translated into the clinical vocabulary of late 19th century medicine. The will is prior to consciousness. It is not the product of deliberation or choice. It drives the behavior before the rational mind has had a chance to organize a justification for the behavior. The rational mind then constructs the justification afterward, which gives the impression of rational agency while the actual driving is done below by something that predates rationality. This is not a comfortable picture of the self. We prefer to believe that our desires are chosen, that the self is in charge of its own wanting. Schopenhauer says, mostly no. The will wants first. Reason follows to clean up. This is the ordinary condition. He does not say this to create despair. He says it because it is accurate, and accuracy is the beginning of anything useful. If most of what you want is being wanted by the will before deliberation has a chance to weigh in, then the project of managing your life through pure rational determination is going to fail, has always failed, and will always fail in a specific and predictable way. But something else is possible: the cultivation of awareness. Not the elimination of the will, that is the ascetic's path, and it is available only to the ascetic, but the slow cultivation of a small distance between the will's arising and the behavior it produces. That distance is where what we usually call character lives. Wittgenstein, the philosopher who transformed the philosophy of language in the 20th century, counted Schopenhauer among the 3 or 4 thinkers who had most shaped his thinking. He said Schopenhauer had taught him something about the limits of what can be said, and that what lay beyond those limits was not therefore meaningless or non-existent. The will is beyond those limits. Music is beyond those limits. The specific quality of a September morning on the Main is beyond those limits. These things are real. Language runs out before them, they remain. Chapter 23, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche was 21 years old when he found a copy of The World as Will and Representation in a Leipzig used bookshop in the autumn of 1865. He has described the experience of reading it. He read for 2 weeks in a sustained state of excitement that he found difficult to distinguish from recognition, the feeling that he had been given the words for something he had already known without being able to articulate. Every page seemed addressed to him specifically. The diagnosis of suffering as structural, the claim that the will was the inner nature of things, the aesthetic theory, the ethics of compassion. All of these found him in a specific way that good philosophy sometimes finds its readers. He called Schopenhauer my great educator. He meant it entirely and maintained it even after he had developed his own philosophy in direct opposition to Schopenhauer's conclusions. The opposition is important and worth understanding, because it is one of the most significant philosophical arguments of the 19th century, and because it is a real argument, not a misunderstanding, but a genuine disagreement between two people who had seen the same things and drawn different conclusions. Schopenhauer's response to the will: stand back from it, seek the aesthetic release, practice compassion, aspire toward the ascetic's withdrawal. The recommended attitude is one of equanimity, of watching the will's insistence from a slight distance, cultivating the temporary releases, accepting what cannot be escaped without being consumed by it. Nietzsche's counter, saying no to the will, is saying no to life. The will produces both the suffering and the great art, both the ordinary misery and the extraordinary achievement. To escape the will's insistence is to escape the thing that makes intensity possible. His answer is amor fati, love of fate. Say yes to the will in all its difficulty, including and especially the suffering. Affirm everything, the beautiful and the terrible, because everything is the same thing. He said Schopenhauer was a pessimist and had not gone far enough. He said the pessimist who looks at suffering and recommends withdrawal was still in the grip of the same morality he was trying to transcend. Schopenhauer would have replied that amor fati is more willing, more insistence on the will's expression, now reframed as affirmation. The will does not become less insatiable because you have decided to celebrate its insatiability. You are still in it. You have just changed your emotional relationship to being in it. Both of them were right about something the other did not fully see. The argument between them is the argument that every person who has understood anything real about desire is eventually inside. Not whether desire produces suffering, both agree it does, but what your relationship to that fact should be. Acceptance without celebration, or celebration of the whole. The answer you find to this question is probably the most personal philosophical question you will ever face. Chapter 24. What actually quiets the will? He is, in his essays, a practical thinker. The Parerga and Paralipomena, the collection of essays published in 1851 that finally made him famous, contains practical wisdom of a kind that the technical philosophical works do not always foreground. He writes about solitude as a practice, not a deprivation. He says that the person who cannot be alone with themselves has no interior life worth inhabiting, and that the person who can be alone, genuinely alone, not waiting for the solitude to end, not filling it with noise or digital company or the constant reassurance that other people provide, has access to something that is otherwise unavailable. He writes about the vita contemplativa in a way that distinguishes it clearly from idleness. The contemplative life, in his sense, is not the life of doing nothing, It is the life organized around the quality of attention rather than the quantity of activity. 4 hours of genuine intellectual work are worth more than 12 hours of managed busyness. An hour of genuinely present walking is worth more than an afternoon of distracted productivity. The quality of attention is the thing. Everything else is secondary. He writes about the relationship between suffering and temperament, about the fact that most of what we experience as the ordinary unhappiness of daily life is not determined by our external circumstances, but by our internal constitution. 2 people in the same circumstances can have radically different experiences of those circumstances, and the difference is in how they attend to them and what they bring to them. This is not advice to ignore genuine hardship. It is the observation that the philosophical work, the cultivation of attention, the practice of the ascetic release, the slow adjustment of what one expects from the will actually changes the quality of experience. He also writes about the relationship between good health and philosophical capacity. He was not a Stoic about the body. He did not think the body's condition was a matter of indifference. He ate well and walked every day, and paid attention to sleep, and believed that the mind's capacity to do what he was asking it to do was dependent on the body being managed correctly. The 4 hours of morning work required a body that had slept and eaten and moved. Wittgenstein said something similar from a different direction, that clarity in thinking was inseparable from clarity in living, and that the person who was deceiving themselves about how they were living would find that deception spreading into their thinking. They were both pointing at the same thing. The philosophical life is not an intellectual project disconnected from a body and a daily existence. It is a daily existence organized around the possibility of clarity. What quiets the will is not the achievement of any desire, it is the shift in what you attend to and how you attend to it. It is the morning walk taken with genuine attention. It is the music heard without the overlay of evaluation. It is the meal eaten because the food is actually good, not because eating it proves something. It is the thought followed all the way through, honestly, without stopping before the uncomfortable conclusion. He did this. He found it sufficient. Chapter 25. The night he heard Rossini again. He is in his late 60s in the Frankfurt Opera House attending a Rossini program. He has been coming to this house for more than 30 years. He knows the building. He knows the particular acoustic of the hall, the way certain frequencies in the upper register carry further than they do in other houses. He knows the program, the works to be performed, the particular areas in each. He has heard most of them before, some of them dozens of times across 30 years in various productions. He finds his seat. The question, a question he has thought about carefully from both sides, is whether familiarity diminishes the aesthetic experience or deepens it. Whether the music you know becomes less capable of producing the release because the surprise element is gone. His answer arrived at through experience rather than theory. It depends on what you mean by surprise. If you mean that the first encounter with a great work of art has a quality that subsequent encounters cannot recapture, yes, obviously. You cannot unhear something. You cannot return to the state of not having encountered what you have encountered. But what he has found across 30 years with the same music is that the first encounter is replaced by something different, a quality of recognition that is itself a kind of release. The will quiets not because it is surprised, but because the music is genuinely saying something true about the will's own structure, and the recognition of that truth across 30 years of encounters has deepened rather than diminished. The soprano sings the aria he has known since Venice in 1818. The melody does what it does. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and 3 other camps and wrote Man's Search for Meaning in 1945, said that the capacity to find something beautiful in the worst circumstances was not a luxury. It was a necessity. The people who retained this capacity under conditions designed to eliminate it were the people most likely to come through with their humanity intact. He was talking about prisoners who found sunsets through the barbed wire worth noticing, who maintained an interior life in the space the conditions had not yet succeeded in destroying. Schopenhauer was not in Auschwitz. He was in the Frankfurt Opera House, and he was 70 years old, and the exterior circumstances were considerably better. But the principle that the capacity to be genuinely in a piece of music is a resource that external circumstances cannot take away applies in both places. The music is available. The capacity to receive it is a practice. He has been practicing for 50 years. The aria ends. He breathes. The will returns, as it always does. He goes home. He sleeps. Chapter 26. Buddhism and the Parallel. He began reading Buddhist texts seriously in the 1820s as translations became available in German and through Latin and English intermediaries. By the time he was writing his mature essays in the 1840s, he had read more widely in the Buddhist tradition than any other European philosopher of his generation. He was not converting. He was verifying. The verification went like this. The central insight of his philosophy, that desire is the source of suffering, that the will cannot be finally satisfied, that there are specific conditions under which the will's insistence can be temporarily released, and that these conditions constitute the practical core of whatever wisdom the philosophical life makes available, had been arrived at through Kant and through his own reflection on the structure of experience. When he encountered the Buddhist tradition, he found that the same insight had been arrived at independently through an entirely different intellectual and spiritual practice over 2,000 years in advance. The first noble truth of Buddhism: life involves dukkha. The word is usually translated as suffering, but the translator's note on dukkha almost always adds, the word covers more than acute suffering. It covers the background unsatisfactoriness of conditioned experience. The sense, present even in moments of pleasure, that the pleasure is impermanent, and that its impermanence is already a kind of lack. This is Schopenhauer's will, named from the inside. The second noble truth: dukkha arises from tanha, craving, thirst. the insatiable wanting that points always at what is not yet the case. This is identical to what Schopenhauer has been arguing. The Buddhist analysis and the European philosophical analysis name the same structure. The third noble truth, dukkha, can cease. This is where Schopenhauer is most interested. The claim is not that the will can be permanently dissolved in ordinary life, he knows better than to claim this, but that there are genuine conditions under which the will's insistence quiets, and that these conditions are accessible. The fourth noble truth, there is a path toward those conditions. He said he could not understand how a European could read the Buddhist teaching and not recognize in it the most honest available account of what human consciousness is like from the inside. He said the West had been inventing consolations for 2,000 years rather than looking clearly at the thing that required consolation. He was generous about this in a way that was not always his default mode. He was generous because he recognized that the Buddhist tradition had done the work carefully. It had taken the honest look that he believed European philosophy had mostly avoided. Chapter 27, Sleep as Nirvana. He writes about sleep explicitly. He thinks about it with the same precision he brings to everything, and follows the argument to where it leads without softening the conclusions to make them more comfortable. Sleep is the temporary withdrawal of consciousness from the will. While you sleep, the will continues. It has to. The body's insistence on continuing is what the will is at the biological level, and the body does not stop insisting during sleep. The heart beats. The breath moves. The cells repair themselves. The immune system does its nightly work. These are all expressions of the will to live, the body's fundamental insistence on persisting in existence. And none of them require the conscious self to authorize or direct them. But the part of the will that narrates, that evaluates the day's events, that plans tomorrow, that maintains the anxieties about money and relationships and status and the future, that runs the mental tape of the things that went wrong and composes the revised responses that did not actually happen, this part is offline. The desiring, projecting, narrating self has suspended operations. This is why sleep feels like relief. Not a passive absence of something unpleasant, a genuine release. The will has been doing something that takes energy and produces suffering, and for these hours it is not doing that. The relief is real. The specific feeling of letting go at the end of a long day. The physical settling. The moment when the body accepts the bed and the mind accepts that it is not on duty, is the will's conscious insistence releasing temporarily and genuinely. He extends this. The dream state is philosophically interesting because it shows the representational faculty at work without the usual constraints of waking perception. In dreams, the mind constructs a world of objects and events and narratives. This is what the mind does. This is the fundamental machinery of representation, but freed from the corrective feedback of the senses. The result is the particular vividness and emotional immediacy of dreams. The fear in the nightmare is real fear. The joy in the vivid dream is real joy. These are the will constructing freely, showing you what it looks like when the usual filters are removed. This is why dreams can be so much more intense than waking experience. The filter is off. He was not afraid of death. He had thought about it more carefully than most people are willing to, and his position was one he found genuinely convincing rather than merely convenient. The individual is a temporary pattern in the will's expression. The pattern has a particular duration and a particular form, the form of Arthur Schopenhauer, with his specific history and his specific poodle and his specific route along the main river. This pattern ends. What does not end is the will itself, which organized the pattern. It continues to organize other patterns. This is not the same as personal immortality. He knew this. He was not offering that consolation because he did not believe it was honest to offer it. What he was offering was more specific. The recognition that the boundary between the individual and what continues is not where it appears. The individual self is a construction of the will plus representation. The will itself is not individual. When you fall asleep, a version of this dissolution happens every night. The constructed self suspends, and what remains is the will continuing without narration. You are already doing this every night. He was simply telling you what you were doing. Let your breath slow. The will is beginning to quiet. Let it. Chapter 28. The sentence in the preface. In the preface to the first edition of The World as Will and Representation, published in 1818, he wrote a sentence that nobody quoted for 33 years. He had been thinking about how to characterize the nature of the work. He had considered calling it a system, but rejected the word because systems in philosophy, he thought, were usually ways of imposing a false appearance of completeness on things that were not complete. He had considered calling it a treatise, but rejected this because a treatise implied that the argument could be separated from the prose in which it was made, and he did not believe this about his work. What he said instead was this: the book communicated a single thought, one thought only. But the thought was of a kind that required 4 completely different approaches to express fully, 4 starting points, 4 lines of travel converging on the same territory. A reader who had genuinely understood the thought by the end of the 4th approach would look back and find that every page of the book was the same page, seen from a different angle. He also said the book needed to be read twice. He wrote this as an instruction, not an apology. The first reading built the structure. The second reading revealed what had been sitting inside each part all along. He wrote this at 30, and nobody read it. The first edition sat in the warehouse. The sentence sat in the preface of an unsold book. The 33 years passed. He continued to work. In 1851, the Leipzig Review arrived. In the years after 1851, as the world began to catch up, the sentence became one of the most quoted things in the secondary literature. Scholars cited it as evidence of unusual philosophical self-awareness. Students underlined it. It was treated as a kind of key to the whole. He had written it knowing it was true, into a silence that was not going to confirm it for 3 decades. The truth of it did not depend on the confirmation. The confirmation eventually arrived. The truth was always there. Viktor Frankl, whose thinking about meaning and survival was formed in the concentration camps in the 1940s, said that the person who has a compelling enough why can endure almost any how. The why that sustained Schopenhauer through the 33 years of the warehouse was the thought, his belief in the single, real, carefully articulated thought that the book contained and that the world had not yet found its way to. The how was the silence, the empty lecture hall in Berlin, the Frankfurt restaurant table where nobody recognized him. He had the why, he endured the how. The sentence in the preface is still there in every edition. It is still true. Chapter 29. The Conversation with the Visitor. Sometime in the late 1850s, when he was in his 70s and had been famous for nearly a decade, a young philosopher from Heidelberg traveled to Frankfurt to spend a morning with him. The visitor had read everything: the main work, the supplementary volume, the prize essays, the Parerga. He had made notes. He arrived with specific questions and with the particular mixture of intellectual excitement and physical nervousness that comes with meeting the person whose thinking has most changed your own. He found Schopenhauer at breakfast. The poodle was near the chair. The coffee was on the table. The Times of London was folded beside the plate. The philosopher of suffering was eating with evident pleasure. They talked for several hours. Schopenhauer was, by the visitor's account, considerably better company than his reputation suggested. Precise, yes, and sharp when the visitor's questions were imprecise, but also interested, genuinely interested in what the younger man was thinking and where the thinking had led. He made jokes about the German academic establishment with a dry wit that the visitor had not expected. He was interested in what was happening in Heidelberg philosophically, asked specific questions, listened to the answers. And then the visitor asked the question that had been sitting underneath the whole conversation: how do you account for the fact that you seem, by all available evidence, to be genuinely well? He sat with the question for a moment. Then he said something that the visitor recorded carefully and quoted for the rest of his career. He said, "Understanding the structure of the ocean does not mean one drowns in it." He said that knowing the will is insatiable does not diminish the morning walk. It does the opposite. It frees the walk from having to be more than a walk. He was not walking to solve anything. He was not walking to prove anything. He was walking because he found it good to walk, in the specific morning, with the specific quality of light, on the specific river, at the specific pace that his body now required. The bread was good bread because it was good bread. The coffee was good coffee. The poodle was good company because poodles are good company. He was not asking any of these things to be more than they were, and they were, each of them, genuinely what they were. The visitor wrote about this conversation for decades afterward. He said it was the most practically useful philosophical conversation he had ever had. The philosopher who had argued most clearly that the will cannot be finally satisfied had found, through the argument and through the years that followed it, something that looked, from the outside and apparently from the inside as well, like genuine daily contentment. Come back gently. We are close to the end. Let your body be heavy where it rests. Chapter 30. The Recognition. September 1851. come back with me to the Schöne Aussicht. He has read the review, he has set it down, he has fed Butz, he has drunk the last of his coffee. What is he feeling? Not vindication in the triumphant sense. Vindication would suggest that the book needed the external confirmation to be what it was, and he has never believed that. The book was what it was in 1818, and it remained what it was in 1851, and the Leipzig Review did not change what it contained. He has always known what it contained. But something is different in this September morning than in the September mornings before it, and he is honest enough to notice what it is. The difference is relief. Not the relief of a person who has been uncertain and is now certain. The relief of a person who has been certain alone for a very long time and is no longer alone in the certainty. 33 years is a long time to hold something true without confirmation. He had held it, he had been right, but the holding had taken something. The morning walks had been real, and the music had been real, and the poodle had been real, and the restaurant table had been real, and the holding had also been real, and it had taken something. He puts on his coat. He picks up the walking stick. Butz is already at the door. The morning is clear. The river is grey and moving south. The docks are beginning their day. A vendor is arranging flowers that she brought in from somewhere further south. The market is opening. The Frankfurt morning is doing what Frankfurt mornings do, regardless of what has arrived in the post. He walks south along the river. He thinks about the review, yes. He also thinks about the essay he has been working on. He has been circling an argument about the aesthetics of lyric poetry, about why certain kinds of poetry create the feeling that the poem knew something about the reader before the reader read it, and what this implies about the relationship between the individual will and the structure of consciousness that underlies it. He thinks this will be a good essay. He has been thinking it for several weeks. He turns at the tree. He comes back by the other path. He stops at the market and looks at the flowers. The recognition has arrived. The morning is the same morning it was before the recognition arrived. The morning has always been sufficient. That is the thing he has been trying to say for 33 years, and the Leipzig Review is the most recent evidence that he was right to say it. He goes home. He sits at his desk. He picks up the pen. Chapter 31, The Conversation He Never Repeated. In 1831, the year he left Berlin for Frankfurt, he visited his mother in Weimar for the last time. Johanna Schopenhauer was 68 years old. She had been a widow for 26 years and had, in those years, built a life of considerable public recognition. Her novels had gone through multiple editions, her travel writing had been translated. Her salon had been one of the genuine cultural institutions of the German Romantic period. She had done this largely on her own intelligence and energy, without significant support from her son, who had been absorbed in his own work in ways that had made him an inconsistent correspondent and an inconsistent son. Arthur was 43. He had the main work, the essay on the principle of sufficient reason, the essay on color theory, 20 years of thinking and walking and writing in rented rooms. He had not been hired. He had not been widely read. He had not been the philosopher he had known at 30 he was going to be. He came to Weimar wanting something. He did not articulate precisely what it was, because he was the kind of person who found it easier to articulate the structure of the will than to articulate his own particular wants within it. She said something to him on the staircase of her house as he was leaving. The accounts are not precise about the words. They agree on the shape. It was something about his work and something about his manner and something that crossed a line between honesty and cruelty in a way that left a mark. He left. He did not visit again. She died in 1838. He received the news in Frankfurt and did not attend the funeral. His sister Adele, who had been closer to Johanna, wrote to him about it. He responded briefly and with a correctness that left no room for the grief he may or may not have felt. He never repeated what she said. He referred to it in letters over the following years only obliquely as the conversation or the thing that was said in Weimar, without specifying the content. He had decided to carry it rather than to examine it. Carrying it without examining it left it intact as a weight. Examining it would have changed its nature. He was a philosopher of extraordinary precision about the will, and on this one subject he was not precise. He built something extraordinary in the space left by what she had said. Whether the building was because of the saying or despite it is the kind of question that cannot be answered cleanly. Both things are probably true. Chapter 32, Frankfurt, the final decade. The years between the Leipzig Review and his death in 1860 were the most fully inhabited of his life. The visitors came from across Germany and beyond. Students who had read the work without having been directed to it by any teacher. Philosophers who had known the work and wanted to meet the man. Writers who had been influenced without always knowing it. He received them in his rooms, or walked with them along the Main, or sat with them at his restaurant table. He was, by all accounts, good company. He was also still working. He prepared a third edition of the main work with revisions and additions. He continued to write essays. He maintained a substantial correspondence that he answered with care. He did not stop thinking because the world had finally caught up. He was, at the same time, old. He moved more carefully. The morning walk along the Main was slower than it had been. Butz was slower too. They walked at the pace available to them, and neither seemed troubled by the difference from earlier years. The visitors who came in this period left accounts that converge on the same set of observations. He was funnier than they expected. He was more generous with his time and attention than they expected. He was more genuinely interested in what they were thinking than they expected. He was also, when they said something philosophically imprecise or confused, direct about the imprecision in a way that was clarifying rather than cruel. He had learned in the Frankfurt years the difference. He had also, by all evidence, made his peace with the long silence. Not forgiven it exactly, he remained capable of sharp commentary about the philosophers who had been celebrated while he was ignored. But he had stopped being in the middle of it. He had arrived somewhere that the silence was behind him, and what lay ahead was the work remaining to be done, and the mornings remaining to be walked, and the music remaining to be heard. He was content. Not satisfied, the will does not produce satisfaction. He had known this for 50 years. But content in the specific way of a person who has organized their life around what is actually available and has found what is actually available to be sufficient. Chapter 33. The Morning Walk. He gets up at 7. He washes his face with cold water. He dresses with the care he has always taken with his appearance, not for vanity, but for the same reason he takes care of the morning routine. Things maintained properly, work properly. He eats breakfast. He reads. At 9, he puts on his coat and picks up his walking stick and opens the door. The route has been the same route for nearly 30 years. Left from the building, along the Schönaussicht, down toward the river, south along the river to the tree that marks the turn, back by the other path through the market, an hour in most weathers. He has walked this route in rain, and in the particular Frankfurt winter cold that comes off the river, and in the September light that is different from every other month's light. He has walked it in the years when nobody knew his name, and in the years when everyone in Frankfurt knew his name. The route has been the same. Butz knows the route. Butz has known the route for years. The dog walks at his pace, which is now a slower pace than it was, and does not object to this. He watches the river. This is something he has been doing for 29 years, and he has not exhausted it. The surface of the main is different every morning. Different light, different wind, different clarity of air. In October, the light comes off the water at a low angle that does not appear in any other month. In April, there is a particular quality to the air above the water on certain mornings that has no name he has found adequate to it. He has been watching these things for 29 years, and he is still watching. This is what he means by a certain kind of attention. Not the philosopher's attention that classifies and generates propositions, just the looking. The river is not a symbol of anything. It is the river in this morning, with this light moving south. Marcus Aurelius, in a tent on the Danube frontier somewhere around 170 AD, writing notes to himself that he never intended anyone else to read, returned again and again to one principle, that his well-being was not determined by what happened to him, but by his relationship to what happened. He wrote this in the cold and the exhaustion of a campaign he had not wanted, as a reminder rather than a discovery, because the reminder was what he needed to keep the principle active. The principle faded without the reminder. Schopenhauer did not need to write this down. He had built an entire philosophical system on the same principle, but he still walked along the river every morning and watched the light on the water, because the walk was the practice of what the system described. He turns at the tree. He walks back by the market path. The day is beginning. Chapter 34. The Dog and the Philosopher. He is in his rooms in the late evening. The meal is finished. The flute has been played, one of the Italian pieces he has returned to for years, simplified to the range his technique can manage, complete within that range. He has read. The lamp burns at the level that suits the hour, which is lower than the level needed for writing. Butz is on the floor near the chair. The dog is old. It arranges itself on the floor with the deliberate care of an animal that has learned to manage what age has made more effortful. Once settled, it is settled completely. It breathes. It is in the room without performance. It is not demonstrating its presence or waiting for acknowledgement. It is simply here. He looks at the dog. He has written about this, about what the poodle's presence in his life represents philosophically. He has written about the will to live in the dog and the will to live in himself, and about how at the deepest level these are the same drive expressed through different patterns. He has written about the poodle's freedom from the narrating self, from the suffering of the person who lies awake, adding commentary to the day's events. He has written about the dog's directness, about its wants. Looking at the dog in the lamplight, he is also just looking at the dog. There is a kind of knowledge that is not about understanding a thing, but about being with it. The 40 years of philosophical work on the nature of the will have given him one kind of knowledge of what is in this room. The 20 years of walking with this dog and its predecessors along the main in various weathers have given him a different kind. Both are real. Neither one cancels the other. He thinks about the Upanishads, which he has been reading since 1813 and which still offer him things. The teaching on Atman and Brahman, the individual self that is, at the deepest level, continuous with the ground of everything. The poodle in this lamplight, in this room, at the end of this ordinary Frankfurt evening, is doing what 40 years of philosophy have been attempting to describe. It is fully in the moment it is in. It wants what is available. It does not want what is unavailable. It has no gap between what it is and what it wants to be. He has narrowed the gap through the years, but not closed it. He is still Arthur Schopenhauer, with his opinions about Hegel and his theories about music and his 33 years of being right before anyone noticed. The gap is still there. But in the lamplight, looking at the old dog on the floor, it feels manageable. The wanting is there, and the evening is here, and both of them are, for now, exactly what they are. Chapter 35, What the Will Rests in. He is 72 years old. It is the summer of 1860. He knows, in the way that bodies begin to communicate before doctors confirm, that he is near the end of the time available to him. He does not know the specific date. He continues his routines. The morning walk is slower, but it continues. The fruit is in the evenings. Butz is still there. The visitors still come, though he manages the visits with more care about his energy than he did 2 years ago. He has spent 44 years developing, testing, and living inside a philosophical system that begins with a diagnosis of suffering and ends with a specific set of practices for living within that diagnosis without being destroyed by it. What, across those years, has the system shown him? The will cannot be satisfied. He was right about this at 30. He is right about it at 72. The 42 years between contain no evidence that he was wrong. The recognition, the visitors, the third edition of the main work, none of these have produced a permanent peace. They have produced good mornings and useful evenings and the specific pleasure of conversations with people who have understood something genuinely difficult. But the will continues. The will can be temporarily released. Through music, he has confirmed this hundreds of times in concert halls in Dresden, Frankfurt, Venice. Through the morning walk, taken with genuine attention. through the lamplight room with the poodle, through the 4 hours of careful morning work in which a thought is being thought as carefully as he can think it and nothing else is happening, through genuine compassion, through the moments when the boundary between himself and another being has thinned enough to allow actual perception of their reality. These releases are available. They have been available every day, regardless of what the Leipzig literary journals were saying. They will be available tomorrow. The person who knows that the will cannot be finally satisfied and who has reliable access to temporary release is better equipped for the life that is actually available than the person who is still waiting for the final satisfaction. Not free of suffering, not outside the will's insistence, but with more honest equipment, a slightly wider space. Enough. He picks up the pen. There is still work to be done. He does it. Chapter 36. Frankfurt, September 1851. Again. Come back with me. The schöne Aussicht. The river below. The September morning. The light that September has that no other month has. He folds the newspaper. He sets it on the table. He feeds Butz the last piece of roll. He puts on his coat. He picks up the walking stick. The door opens. The morning air comes in, cool, carrying the river smell, the smell of the market beginning, the particular smell of Frankfurt in September that he has been breathing for 20 years, and that is, still, the smell of morning. He walks. He is not walking as the vindicated philosopher. He is not walking as the pessimist confirmed by 33 years of silence. He is not walking as anything in particular. He is walking as the specific 63-year-old man that he is, with a walking stick and a poodle and a route along the river that has been his route for 20 years. The river is moving, the docks are beginning, the market vendor is arranging flowers, the Frankfurt morning is doing what it does, without reference to the Leipzig literary journal. He thinks about the review for a while, and then he thinks about the essay on lyric poetry he has been working on, the argument he has been circling for weeks about why certain poems create the feeling that the poem knew something about the reader before the reading happened, the way a poem can find the exact shape of a private experience, hold it up as if it were general, as if it belonged to everyone, because in some fundamental sense it does. He is close to the argument. He thinks today's walk may be the walk where the circle closes. He is also not thinking about anything. He is also just walking. Both are true. The thinking and the not thinking. The philosophical project and the mourning that contains it. The will that drives everything, and the walk along the river that the will takes when it is in the form of Arthur Schopenhauer on a September morning in Frankfurt in 1851. The wanting is still there. It will always be there. It does not dissolve because you have understood it, but the understanding changes the quality of the relationship to it. The wanting is there, and the mourning is there, and the mourning is enough. It has always been enough. You have been listening for a long time. Your body knows what to do now. The will is quieting on its own, the way it does every night, the way it has always done, long before there was a philosopher to name it. Let the weight of the day go into the surface beneath you. The river moves south. The poodle keeps pace. What the night gives you is not silence. It is permission to want nothing until morning. Sleep now.